afternoon, everyone. I think we're about to get started. It's approaching 3 o'clock, so we'll keep things going. My name is Anne Renee Reeser, and I'm a member of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics, and thank you for attending this afternoon's book talk. The Dole SAB is composed of students committed to the work of the Dole Institute. We attend regular meetings, assist in events like this, and plan an SAB-sponsored program every semester. Members of the SAB receive great opportunities to network with our special guests, like today's speaker. If you're interested and would like to join, please contact the Dole Institute. The Dole Institute would also like to hear from you. If you enjoyed this afternoon's book talk, let us know by connecting with us on Facebook, Twitter, or through our website email. Your attendance and feedback help shape future programming. Before we begin today, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. After the book talk, we will have time for some audience questions and answers. If you have a question, raise your hand, and I'll come by with a mic, and try to keep your questions brief and limited to just one question. And finally, if at any time during the book talk you have difficulty hearing, please alert me. I'll be standing in the back, and we can help you with our hearing assisted devices. And now please welcome Director Bill Lacey.
Thanks, Anne Renee. Thanks to all of you for coming out. It's a very, very nice crowd today. I think you probably saw us doing our normal routine here when we have a very successful program of doing a little bit of a fire drill on getting up the new chairs, but we love to have that happen. So thanks for giving us a chance to practice again. Do want to point out that a couple of you are kind enough, we were such Dole Institute junkies, you were kind enough to point out that we have a mistake on our program that we handed out to you. The Lincoln program, which it says is tonight, is, as a matter of fact, Thursday night. We have a matter of policy never scheduling games up against programs up against home basketball games because for obvious reasons. But anyway, that will be a fascinating program, and I encourage all of you to come. Thursday night, 7:30 here. Mike Vorenberg is the author of a very important book on President Lincoln and the ratification of the 13th Constitutional Amendment. It was heavily used in the film that came out about a year ago, Lincoln, starring Daniel Day-Lewis. And we're going to talk to him about that, and I think it'll be very enlightening and a lot of fun. Today's program is going to be very enlightening, too. And let me just say at the outset that I picked up my copy of the book. There are still a few copies out here left, so if you want to grab, a number of you bought them on the way in, but if you want to grab a copy on the way out, do pick it up. We'll do a book signing immediately after the program, and these would make great Christmas gifts, by the way, so feel free to pick up as many copies as you'd like. Now, there's no doubt that one of the toughest problems our country faces is immigration and the need for reform in this area. Our guest today is Álvaro Vargas Llosa. Mr. Llosa's latest book is Global Crossings, Immigration and Civilization in America, which makes a call for open minds and provides a pro-immigration agenda for reform. Llosa argues that immigration can be a defining force in the arena of competitive globalization, and the people of those countries who embrace immigration will enjoy more prosperous, peaceful, and freer lives in the emerging world. We had a chance to talk at some length this afternoon, and I just found his thoughts to be fascinating, and I think you'll enjoy what he talks about today very, very much. Mr. Llosa has been extensively published. I won't go into lots of details because you have it on your program. He's been extensively published and has spoken to the World Economic Forum, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the Cato Institute, the World Affairs Council, among many, many others. He currently serves as a senior fellow at the Independent Institute. Please welcome Álvaro Vargas Llosa.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much, Bill, for that wonderful introduction. I'm really honored to be here at the Dole Institute of Politics and to be able to share some thoughts with you. What I'm going to do is, they asked me to speak for about 30 to 40 minutes, so I'm going to have to leave out some of the topics I usually like to bring into the discussion, but maybe you can raise them in the Q&A session. I will leave security for that, because if I start talking about security, it'll take 30 minutes, and so maybe if you want to ask a question later, I'll talk about that and some of the other issues. So Let me tell you a little bit about myself before, most of you probably don't know me very well, so, and I don't like to have people, wonder where I'm coming from at this. I'm originally from Peru. I'm a resident of the US. I'm based in DC, but I'm a citizen of Peru. Everything I say today about immigration in the US, I have said in my own country of origin, and I've said in Europe, where I've spent a lot of time. This is a vision I have that is, irrespective of where I am speaking and where I am based. My political ideas can be described, I guess, as libertarian leaning. I define myself in Spanish as a liberal, but the meaning in the US is a very different one. Unfortunately, the word liberal is a very beautiful word that was actually one of the few contributions made by the Spanish language to the political lexicon universally. It's a word that was born in the early 19th century in Spain during a resistance movement against the regime, absolutist monarchy in Spain. But anyway, that's a different issue. So I'm going to talk a little bit about immigration, and then maybe we can discuss some of this later. Obviously, a very controversial topic. I am very much pro-immigration, and I want to try and make the case in the following way. Many of you are probably very much aware of the different myths that are, or let's say that's a loaded word, of the arguments that are made against immigration out there. So let me take a few of those and try and approach them from my viewpoint and try to persuade you that there's another way to look at this. And I call them myths because they really are, to me at least, myths. When we look at some of the history, we look at some of the data, many of these arguments are really arguments that are not very solid, not very much based on fact. There really are the rationalization of emotion and passion. One of the things that I've heard said time and again about immigration is that in the US is that for a very long time the US got the right kind of immigrants. There was a kind of golden era of immigration, mostly European immigration, Northern European immigration. And then recently we've started to get in the United States the wrong kinds of immigrants. Immigrants who don't share our culture, don't share our economic viewpoint, don't understand the foundations of this republic. So this is really a new type of immigrant that we're getting here. And that is simply not true. If we look at the history, the United States has received throughout the years, the decades, and the centuries, different waves of immigrants. The first wave, yes, was mostly Northern European. Until about 1880, it was mostly Northern European. But even then, there was a wide spectrum of people coming from different countries of what we might call Northern Europe, vaguely. But then after that, from 1880 to 1920, it was all about Southern Europeans and Eastern Europeans and Central Europeans who had very little in common with Northern Europeans, not the same language, not the same culture, very, very different. They didn't look the same at all. And that was a very different type of immigrant. And people tend to think of this new era of immigration as being kind of disproportionately large by comparison to what went on in the past. And that is, again, not true, because if you look at the 19th century and the early 20th century, let's say from 1860 to 1920, the proportion of immigrants compared to the society at large was between 13 and 15% of the population. And it's about that today. It's about 13, 14% today. So the numbers really haven't changed all that much. And yes, there were a few periods during the 20th century when immigration dropped a bit. So the average, that kind of, the average for the 20th century is really about 10, 11%. So really not that different from what is the proportion today. Another important myth in this discussion is that this is really a disproportionately American problem. The rest of the world is not really suffering the impact of immigration in the way that the United States is. And if you look at the data, again, this is not true. This problem is, if it's a problem that you share with almost everybody else around the world. Even poor countries get immigrants from even poorer countries. In Latin America, which is where I come from, it's really fascinating to see. The Dominican Republic, a poor country, gets a lot of immigrants from Haiti, and some of the issues that, the tensions that we're experiencing in the United States are already taking place there as well. Argentina, for years, has been getting Bolivians and Ecuadorians and Peruvians and so on. And again, some of these tensions developing there as well. Currently, about 30 million people sneak into countries illegally every year around the world. And that's about 1/7 of the total number of immigrants there are in any given year, which is about 215 million. And only about 3% of the world population is first-generation immigrant. And the proportion of first-generation immigrants in the United States is about that as well. So very similar numbers to what's going on in the rest of the world. Again, going back to this idea that we used to get the right kind of immigrants, but now we get the wrong kind of immigrants. It's really fascinating to go and look back at the way that people approached immigration back then in the 19th century and the early 20th century. Many of the arguments that are made against immigrants today were made against immigrants then. And some of the stereotypes, the cultural and ethnic stereotypes that make us cringe today were born out of a hostile approach to immigrants back then by some segments of the population. I mean, the idea of the Irish drunkard and the Italian mobster and the Jewish miser and all these things were born out of the tensions of those eras. There was even a party in the United States in the mid-19th century, the Know Nothing Party, that was really very much about hostility to immigration. And it was, in many ways, a convergence of different strands of opinion that had been in existence since the beginning of the Republic. That was really, a very kind of interesting social phenomenon and also ideological phenomenon. There was some of the anti-Catholic sentiment from the end of the 18th century was still there in the mid-19th century. The idea that Catholics were a very repressive kind of religion and culture, and the idea being that if too many Catholics came into the United States, they would have this very negative impact on the way religion and politics related to each other. There was also a notion that Europeans were very radical. They brought these very radical ideas with them, and they would make a kind of they would have a very dangerous effect on the body politic, because they could stir up a lot of trouble and create instability and so on. And there was also, of course, a lot of pride in the Anglo-Saxon tradition. So all these different strands of opinion, currents of opinion, kind of converged into the Know Nothing Party in the middle of the 19th century. And he had a very active participation in the debates at the time, and it stirred up a lot of hostility against immigrants that sometimes took a violent expression, and some of the worst lynchings that took place in the end of the 19th century, even the early 20th century, kind of, I guess, arose from those sentiments, those views. So it's important to understand there's been hostility to immigration, just as there's been hostility to immigration elsewhere in the United States. And this is not something new, and it's not true that people always welcomed immigrants in the country. People who speak well of the previous waves of immigrants today are not aware of the way in which those immigrants were received by people at the time who had very similar ideas to the ones they have now when they speak about Mexican or Central American immigrants today. And it's really fascinating when you look at some of the things that were said and published in papers and speeches that were made in Congress and so on they really echo, well, it's actually the other way around. What happens today echoes what was happening back then. So this is really interesting. One of the things that has been constant in I think, in relation to the issue of immigration is the disconnect between the law and reality. And that is really at the heart of this problem, because the law has very much tended to reflect, of course, public sentiment about this issue. And so it has tended to react to immediate events without really considering what the effects would be in the long term. And so usually what has tended to happen has been contradictions between one law and another, side effects of all kinds, lack of anticipation, the failure to see what would happen in the next few years and how that would impact the legislation and vice versa. So, for instance, for 30 years, there was a thing called the Texas Proviso that made it legal to hire an undocumented immigrant, and yet illegal to bring him or her into your house just for a glass of water. Another interesting example is in 1965, there was a major change in the law. It was one of the watershed moments. A previous watershed moment had been in 1923, 1924, of course, when the first really important and sort of wide-ranging restrictions on immigration were placed in the U.S. Well, in 1965, they changed the law. And so what they did is they removed what was until then sort of, I guess you could call, national quotas. And they replaced them with hemispheric quotas. In other words, they really weren't looking at quotas country by country, but really kind of hemisphere by hemisphere. And if you read some of the speeches made in Congress when this law was being discussed, it's really fascinating. Nobody anticipated that the law would have the effect of course, a huge drop in European immigration and a big rise in Latin American and Asian immigration. Nobody really foresaw the amount of Latin American and Asian immigrants that would come into the country. So it's another interesting example. Another example, between 1940 and 1960, there was something called the Bracero program. It was a guest worker agricultural program that was really successful. In those 2 decades, illegal immigration dropped to almost zero. That was one of the few periods I mentioned before in the 20th century where there was very little immigration. And so they did away with the program. They canceled the program in the 60s. It became controversial. There was some abuse. I mean, there were some aspects that became a little ugly, but generally it was a very successful program. And they could have just adjusted the program to do away with some of those aspects and just kept the basics of the program. But they didn't. They canceled the program. So what was the effect of that? Illegal immigration started to rise and rise and rise and became a real problem. And it hadn't been a major issue in the 40s and 50s and even early 60s. So again and again, we see this pattern. In the 90s, for instance, President Clinton was under a lot of pressure to do something about illegal immigration, because that was a period, the 90s, when illegal immigration took off. The economy was booming. There was a lot of demand for them. Obviously, a lot of them came in and found work very, very quickly. So he imposed a lot of restrictions at the time. And what was the effect of that? The effect was that it ended seasonal migration. Until then, what you had was a lot of people who would come in for just 3 months, 4 months, and then go back, in this case to Mexico mostly. So that sort of circular migration process was just completely interrupted by those restrictions. And nobody at the time understood that this was what was going to happen. So what was the effect of that? They immediately created a lot of illegal immigrants that weren't illegal until then. And then made it difficult for those who wanted to come in, because there was I guess a pull factor in the fact that there was demand for their labor. It made it difficult for them to come in legally. So again, it became an incentive for illegal immigration, even though at the time, of course, it was perceived as a very tough measure against illegal immigrants. Some of these examples, I think, show. I have many more in the book, but I just wanted to give you a kind of an idea of how this works. The law as something that doesn't reflect reality and in the end causes reality or has the effect in reality that makes the problem he was trying to solve even worse. And I think this is something that any reform, any attempt at reform of immigration today should really take into account. The amnesty in 1986 by President Reagan, which is really a fascinating thing to examine, because it was, at the time, it was very much seen as of course, the end of the problem. I mean, 3 million people were legalized. Of course, Reagan, being one of those Republicans, was very much pro-immigration. And what happened after a few years after that? Well, the problem is they capped immigration for the future at very low levels, because they didn't anticipate that the booming economy in the following years would attract a lot of immigrants. So what happened was, a few years later, there was this problem again of a lot of illegal immigrants. And so part of the 12 million illegal undocumented immigrants today really stem from the effects of the 1986 amnesty, which is exactly the opposite of what was intended. So I think it's important to bear this in mind. Let me talk a little bit about culture and then the economy. There's this notion that the current waves of immigrants are culturally incompatible with the United States, with culture in the United States. And this is a very general comment, a very general notion. But if you look at it in detail, you will see that it's not really true either. Because, I mean, any way you look at it, religion, family values, the spirit of entrepreneurship, you see very much the same pattern that you've always seen among immigrants. It's that they very much fit into the American mold. If you take religion, it's really interesting. In the last 2 decades, about 70% of immigrants were and are Catholic. And of that 70%, 1/5 describe themselves as born again, which is something they wouldn't do in their country of origin, by the way, in Latin America. Born again is something that's very much associated with Protestants, not with Catholics. And yet, over here, they declare themselves to be born again, even though they're still Catholic. And about 23% are Protestants. So overwhelmingly religious and overwhelmingly Christian, and not only in terms of just a cultural background, but I'm talking about practicing Catholics and practicing Protestants. Family. If you look at family, again, it's very interesting. About half of all undocumented households are made up of couples with children. Only 13% of undocumented households are single-parent households, against 1/3 in the case of the native population. By native, I mean U.S.-born population. Fertility rate. This is another argument that's always made in the cultural arena. They have too many children. They're going to overwhelm us. Well, it's no longer true. The fertility rate has gone down in Latin America, one of the main areas or origins of U.S. immigration, and it's come down even more dramatically among immigrants here in the United States. So if you take the most fertile group among immigrants, and that would be Mexicans still, that's only 60% higher than the native rate of fertility, 60% being, of course, less than 1 child per family. So we're talking really about, and the trend, I mean, is going down and down, so very soon it'll be very much the same as with the native population. If you look at entrepreneurship, there's different ways to measure this. One of them is self-employment, people who start businesses, people who offer their services but are self-employed. And that's about 12% of all immigrants, which is almost the same percentage as for the native population at large, which is about 13%. So any way you look at it, the conduct of immigrants, the way they conduct themselves in U.S. society, very much in line with the patterns you see among the native society. Yes, I mean, there's something that I think we need to be aware of when we, at least those of us who speak for immigration, and an argument that is made against immigration, I think, has a little bit of substance, which is the argument that multiculturalism has eroded or at least poses a challenge somewhere down the road to the values and the culture in the United States. But multiculturalism really is not the product of immigration. It's really the product of academia in the United States and in Europe. It's an intellectual product that came out of the Western, of the rich, prosperous Western academia. And by multiculturalism, I mean this. I mean, in the early 20th century, there was something called Americanization, which was very interesting. It was not really a public policy. It was not really government policy. It was more a social and cultural attitude in the United States that sought to, sort of inculcate Republican values among immigrants and cultural values, so that they would fit in quickly. They would understand the foundations of the republic. They would understand all about individual rights, about liberal democracy, about free enterprise, and of course, above all, the English language. And this was something that, again, it was not really public policy. It was just all over society, and I think there was something to be said for that. It was a very fascinating process, bottom up, that really helped the process of assimilation very much. Now that started to change after the Second World War, mostly because of the multicultural trend. What happened was that this new paradigm emerged. Of course, at the time of decolonization, right after the Second World War, it was a time where people became very much aware of the colonial abuses that had been committed, and of course, there was a big sort of world movement against discrimination and all of that, which was, of course, I mean, who could possibly argue with that? However, this became a kind of slow process of really erosion of some of the values that had made some of these countries great, including the United States. And so it developed into relativism, the idea that all values were equal. Anthropologists and intellectuals like Lévi-Strauss in France began to speak of the need to step back from your own culture. We're studying other cultures because otherwise you would be imposing your own values in other cultures. And then the idea that you needed to deconstruct Western culture to expose the domination in every single aspect of Western culture, kind of evolved from that into social engineering and collective rights based on ethnicity, and then from then to gerrymandering to protect certain ethnic groups and equal employment opportunity and protecting the Spanish language. There was a very small step, and it was taken. And so this process, which I think started with very good intentions, and there may be something to be said for some of its aspects, I think in general eroded Americanization, and even worse than that, created a backlash against immigration. And it just went too far, and it's a process that I think did have a negative effect. However, I mean, that said, again, this was very much a product of academia. It was not something that was brought in by immigrants in general. And even though that is true, assimilation has still taken place along the same patterns than in the past. You can look at this in many different ways. English, for instance, it's very interesting to note that it's still a 3-generation pattern. So the first generation of immigrants, about 40% of them speak English, 60% don't speak much English at all. But the second generation is bilingual, but speaks English better than whatever language we're talking about, Spanish or Chinese or Japanese or Korean, whatever. And the third generation speaks, for the most part, only English. In the case of Latin, Hispanic immigrants, it's really interesting to see. And the third generation has assimilated so much that it's actually completely forgotten the language where they came from. And in fact, it's very interesting to see how the third generation feels so secure, so comfortable in US culture, that they begin to feel a certain pride in their roots, because they don't fear in the way the second generation does, that if they do that, if they manifest this openly, they will suffer the consequences. That's how comfortable they are. That's how they come to celebrate some of these national holidays in exactly the same way that the Italians and the Irish did in their time, and these holidays have now become part of American culture. Well, Cinco de Mayo, that's exactly how it came about. This is really not so much a Mexican holiday and celebration. It's an immigrant celebration by the third generation that became part of U.S. culture. I guess it's all about the defeat of a French army, so it probably wasn't very difficult for it to become part of U.S. culture. But in any case, it was really the same process as you saw with other immigrants. I looked at for instance, marriage, out marriage. In other words, marrying beyond your group, your community. And it's exactly the same pattern as with the Italians, for instance. I compared Mexicans with Italians. The second generation Italians in the early 20th century, they tended to marry among Italians, but the second generation started to move out. It was, I guess the percentage is 18% of Italians of the second generation married non-Italians. Well, in the case of Mexicans, it's 20%, so even more than Italians. And by the third generation, you're talking about 40, 50%. So clearly already completely assimilated. So it's exactly the same process. In terms of how they do economically, again, the first generation struggles, the second generation does much better than the first generation, and the process of adaptation follows the same pattern. If you look at what was happening with Italians and people from Poland and Russia and Eastern Europe back then, they brought in all sorts of cultural behavior that were really perceived by the US population at the time as inimical to their own values. And yet they adapted so quickly that people look back at that era as a golden era of immigration by comparison to this one. Well, exactly the same thing is happening now, except that I would say it's even faster in terms of the economic adaptation. And yes, of course, you have a pocket that is still poor because those are people who recently came in, because it's a process, it's an ongoing process. If that process stopped, the people who are already here and who are poor, you would see them move up in exactly the same way that their parents and grandparents moved up. So when people say to me, well, there's a lot of immigrants who are poor, I mean, there are 3 times more US-born people who are poor. So if the issue is poverty, then let's attack the issue of poverty rather than think that it's an immigrant problem. If you look at, for instance, the number of school-age dropouts, which is another interesting focus of people who are critical of immigration. Well, the number of US-born people who drop out of school is 3 times larger than the number of immigrants who drop out of school. So yes, I mean, a lot of people are dropping out. By a lot, I mean, you know, more I mean, even one is too many people. But again, this is not something that is unique to the immigrant community. This is a problem that's shared by the community at large, including non-immigrants. Let me make just a few points about the economy. Maybe, I don't know how long I've been talking. Yeah, just a couple of points about the economy, and then maybe we can ask some questions and have a discussion. People have a very hard time understanding the contribution that immigrants make to the economy. You've probably heard this many times before. People think that they take away jobs from the native population, that they impact salaries in a very significant way, and generally that they take away opportunities from the native population. And the way it really works is very much in the way it works domestically. I mean, when you have migration from one state to the other, those dynamics are exactly the same kinds of dynamics that you see on the international stage. Immigration basically corrects imbalances. After the Second World War, even with a sort of high-tech economy, you still needed to do some repetitious mechanical work for which unskilled immigrants were needed. And that's why the US took some from Mexico. That's why France took some from Algeria. Germany took some from Turkey. Spain from Morocco, there was I mean, people who needed the jobs, and there was an economy that needed those people to do certain jobs, and that corrected some imbalances in the economy. So when immigrants come into a country, including the United States, but this is again universal, they come in both as producers and as consumers. So their general impact is to make the pie larger because of the division of labor and specialization. So anytime you add healthy workers to an economy, young healthy workers to an economy, you're going to have an expansion of that economy. A critic of immigration from Harvard, George Borges, came up many years ago with a figure. He tried to calculate, and he's a critic of immigration, a very high-profile critic of immigration. He said that he recognized that they contributed back then about 20 to 25 billion dollars a year. I'm talking about undocumented immigrants. So we updated that figure. It's about $40 billion dollars a year. If you made them legal, the effect would be to greatly enhance that contribution, and different people have come up with different numbers on the left and on the right. It's at least $1 trillion, but maybe $1.5 trillion. What happens when they come in? When at the lower end, they allow people who are at the lower end domestically to move up the scale. Why? Because the economy expands, you need more managerial jobs, you need more people taking up responsibilities for which there was no need before that. And so that helps the local, the domestic kind of labor force move up. And they make those labor-intensive services at the low end of the scale a lot more productive because, I mean, production is virtually unlimited as long as the demand for workers is allowed to meet the supply. So the effect is one of expanding the economy, and therefore it cannot possibly be taking jobs away from the domestic population. I mean, if that was the effect, then how would one explain the fact that 90 million baby boomers and women who've been added to the workforce since the end of the Second World War not only did not create long-term unemployment in the United States, but actually created a lot of jobs? Those 90 million would have destroyed the economy if the effect of a sudden surge of the labor force into the labor force created more problems than it solved. And in terms of salaries, there is a very small effect. We estimate that it's the salary drops at the low end of the scale, at the beginning and temporarily about 1.5%, but that's immediately offset by a 1.8% rise, slightly above that level, and that's only a temporary effect. I mean, if after a few years that is immediately erased by the continuing process and dynamic. In the case of high-skilled immigrants, this is an easier case to make because even critics of immigration sometimes recognize that high-skilled immigrants do make a contribution. But again, I think we should not lose sight of the fact that potentially it could be a lot bigger than what it is today. About 1/3 of PhDs in science and computing and engineering and all of that are immigrants. Immigrants contributed about 5,000 engineers to the Silicon Valley phenomenon. And yet only 1 in 6 visas is a high-skilled H-1B so-called visa. When I applied for an H-1B, I'm a resident now, but when I applied for an H-1B visa several years ago, it was really interesting because this I think it starts in April every year and it goes on until I guess the end of the year. And there was at the time a very small quota. It would be exhausted on day 1. So if you didn't get in there on day 1, you simply would have to wait for another year. And this was really, I mean, from my point of view, extremely unhelpful to the U.S. economy because if the people who are already here legally are making such a huge contribution in terms of the high-skill economy, then it doesn't really make sense that only 1 in 6, 1 in 7 people who get a visa for the United States is a high-skilled immigrant. So clearly the law there again was kind of disconnected from reality. In terms of the cost, I don't want to get into too much detail, how much immigrants cost versus how much revenue they generate for the government, which is another argument. There are several studies. A very important study came out a few years ago by the National Research Institute, which is nonpartisan and is well respected both by the left and the right. And what they did is they tried to calculate the net present cost of immigrants for the next 50 years if you legalize them today. And they came up with very interesting figures. The net effect is a positive $80,000 per immigrant. If you only take low-skill immigrants, it's a negative, so a cost of $5,000. But that's a one-off payment. And we're not taking into account the contribution they would make to the economy. In other words, we're just assuming the economy would continue to be pretty much the same for the next 50 years, which is totally unrealistic, of course. When you get more people into the labor force, you can expand the economy. So even that very conservative figure really, I think, belies some of these notions out there that immigrants cost a lot more than they bring in. Other people, Jeffrey Passel, who's an expert on this, did a very interesting study on immigrants from the 1970s to the 1990s, and he came up with a figure, I guess it was, if I remember correctly, a net positive of $25 billion in terms of revenue over cost, in terms of the fiscal impact. So again, I think we need to look at these figures and this data and try and understand that the contribution to the economy is bound to have an effect on cost versus revenue in terms of the fiscal impact. Otherwise, it wouldn't make any sense. So let me close by saying that I think it's important that we adapt to the world around us. If we don't open our minds to this, we will be, I think, shocked by what we see in the next few years, because this is a process that's really unstoppable in many ways. We're in a world that's increasingly globalized. We've seen the globalization of trade, of services, of capital, and yet not of people, at least not on the same scale. Trade today amounts worldwide to about 45% of world GDP, of the entire world economy. About 20% of savings are invested outside of the country where they originate, and yet only 3% of the world population is first-generation immigrants. So clearly, if we're going to go into a world that's truly global, we're going to have to see the circulation of people gradually matching the circulation of goods and services and ideas, because otherwise there's going to be an imbalance that will eventually hurt the other part of the equation. So I think we need to adapt, and the way to do this, particularly in the United States, I think is to embrace some kind of reform, immigration reform. I was talking to Bill a moment ago about the current bill under discussion. I think that the chances that this will pass anytime soon are not great, but eventually something will have to pass, and I think it's important to learn from the mistakes of the past. I mean, obviously, if you have 12 million people in the shadows, it's not realistic to think you're going to kick them out. I mean, we're not going to see on CNN images of 12 million people walking down the southern border into Mexico. It's just not going to happen. It's not realistic. So do we want 12 million people in the shadows, or is it more realistic to bring them into the light? And again, if we do that, do we want another 12 million people 10, 15 years from now? Well, no, we don't. Then we need to have a flexible system whereby supply and demand match each other. So if the economy needs, on a given year, 500,000 people, then probably it makes sense to have a flexible system that will allow for that. And there will be times when there'll be very few immigrants. In fact, between 2005 and 2010, net immigration came down to zero. I don't know how many people realize that, but and in 2010, I think it was actually negative. In other words, more people leaving the country than coming into the country. Why? Because the environment, which is not that attractive. So the forces of supply and demand, again, probably being more effective than the law itself. So if you have a system that doesn't cap different categories of immigrants at an unrealistic level, and you have a more flexible system that allows supply and demand to match each other, you're probably going to generate an environment that is less conducive to the growth of the undocumented population. So let me leave it there and then perhaps open the floor to some questions. Thank you very much. Yes, I think we have a mic. Yeah.
Yes. Sorry.
Stand up. Okay. Thank you. Do you agree that it is inhumane, the policy of the Dominican government and judiciary right now in regard to Haitians in the Dominican Republic?
I totally agree. And I have a brother who's in the middle of that mess. My brother is the UNHCR representative there. So he's been fighting against that. I don't know how many people are aware of this, but there's a thing called the Constitutional Tribunal. It's like the Supreme Court over here. Just ruled that Haitian immigrants of any generation, in other words, even fourth generation, third generation immigrants are not going to be citizens anymore, which means they're in legal limbo. I mean, they're pariahs because they're not Haitian either. These are people who were born in the Dominican Republic, whose parents were born in the Dominican Republic, whose grandparents were probably born in the Dominican Republic. So no matter what generation you are, you're not a citizen. But you're not a citizen of Haiti either, because you really have no connection to Haiti anymore. So they're in legal limbo. So there's this huge backlash against that. I think they're going to bring the case to the Inter-American Commission. So I'm sure this is not the end of it. But I agree. I think it's inhumane. Yes, over there, please.
You said that third generation like immigrants are pretty much completely Americanized, but with like inner city schools like teaching classes in Spanish and English, how are they like being forced to learn English and become like Americanized?
Well, it really depends where. The way it works is that that probably has more impact among second-generation immigrants than among third-generation immigrants. Simply because for third-generation immigrants, it's very much like learning a second language. So in other words, they come at this really from the same vantage point as American children who are learning English in school. Whereas for the second generation, it's a slightly different process. And although they speak English better than Spanish, they approach this as kind of children of immigrants. There's a very important, I quote a few studies in my book about this, people who've studied what happens with the second and the third generations. And so what that does is it keeps Spanish alive, but it doesn't turn third generation immigrants into immigrants. They're already American, and they are just learning a second language. I mean, really that's the way it works.
I'm an retired elementary teacher, and I noticed at the beginning of my teaching career, there were very few immigrants, children in the public schools in Kansas that I was aware of. And, pardon me, I don't know if the children that came up did not go to public schools or what, but now I see there's a lot more people sending their kids to the public schools. And from a resource position, especially with decreased educational funding and all, but there's been a lot of resources put to English as a second language, which I'm not opposed to, but I think that there are these kids that come into the public schools that have very poor backgrounds, that don't speak English, and have, and then there are state assessments and all on top of that, which I'm speaking as a teacher, it's very difficult to prepare these kids in such a short, amount of time to take these tests, and it puts a real strain, I think, on a lot of the public schools and meeting the needs not only of these kids, but of kids that don't have the non-English background. And do you have any suggestions for that?
Is
I mean,
this,
you talk about first, second, third,
but who's making those decisions? Is this at the school board level? Is this state law? How does that work?
as far as English as a second language, that's state law.
State law? Well, that is I guess, a byproduct of the multicultural era, which is why I said a moment ago that I think there was something to be said for Americanization back then. I mean, I'm not opposed to criticizing that at all. I think it's, if that's the effect it's having, and it's putting an undue strain on the system, and it's not generating the kind of assimilation that it should, then by all means, I think, a reform of that system is perfectly compatible. If the issue is just money, then that is more debatable, because I looked at several states. I didn't look at Kansas in particular, but I did look at California and Texas and New Mexico and some of the states, New York, Florida, the states with the highest number of immigrants. And the way it works is this. First, more than half of immigrant children have at least one parent who's a U.S. citizen. So it's very difficult for the system to look at them as immigrants when they're children of at least one parent who's a citizen. So that's one issue. The other issue is they're paying taxes. Even though they're undocumented, they pay local and state taxes, gas, real estate, and even Social Security, which is really amazing to me. But the last figure, I talked to the federal government, and they told me that the latest figure is about almost $8 billion a year in terms of Social Security taxes paid by undocumented workers who are not supposed to have a Social Security number. So they're paying taxes into the system. So that's a problem, because that makes them part of the system. And how could you have a system that has a two-tier system that discriminates against somebody who's already paying the same taxes that his or her neighbor is paying? It's very difficult for the system, which doesn't mean that it may not generate a problem at the other end, but the fiscal issue is not grounds enough to change the system just for them. You would need to change the system for everybody, because they're actually paying into the system as well. Yeah.
Oh, my name is Ram Flores. I'm interested in knowing whether you think that we can have a structural reform that is pro-immigration, and I am in favor of immigration. In a moment in time in which we've had the diminution of federal power, and especially I was struck by your observation, your comment that you see yourself as a libertarian. And when I think of the kinds of GDP growth that took place between 1930 and 1970, I see so much of the action happening as a result of the federal government as a mediator. But since 1980, I don't see that same structure in place. And I wonder, given the fact that we have fewer resources that course through the economy, that we have increased poverty, for example, that people feel terribly insecure in a world of globalization because of the diminution of labor standards. It's an open-ended question. I'm not certain whether the kind of structural reform that is important can take place in the kind of environment in which we currently are after 1980.
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, and it's one that would probably take another talk to address. One way you're really addressing a problem that is not so much immigration as the nature of the U.S. government and the way it's changed over the years. One thing I looked at is how much the government has grown by in the last century, because I don't know how many of you are aware that Milton Friedman famously wrote that immigration and the welfare system are incompatible with each other. And I always say that that was really meant more against the welfare system than against immigration. But of course, critics of immigration usually take it the other way. But again, it has grown by a factor of 50, about government spending. There's different ways to measure government growth. One way is fiscal spending. By a factor of 50 in the last century, which is really colossal. It's huge. And immigrants are not really to blame for that. Until the Second World War, until after the Second World War and into the 50s, they were not even entitled to relief programs, which were the social aid programs at the time. So they weren't even entitled to that. So that clearly couldn't explain why the government grew under the New Deal and so on, and not even in the 60s under Johnson. So it's clearly it's not a cause and effect relationship between immigration and the growth of government, which doesn't mean, of course, that if the government is handing out stuff, that immigrants are not going to take it. They do. But they do at a much lower rate than people realize. I looked at Medicaid, and the Cato Institute just came out with a very interesting study. They wanted to analyze how much use the immigrants were making of that program, of Medicaid. And it was, the findings are really astonishing. If the native US population used Medicaid at the same rate that immigrants do, the spending would drop by about 40%, it would drop to about 40% of what it is today. So they're really not making much use of Medicaid, which is one of the programs that came out of the growth of government in the United States. So if the question is, do we need to reform the structures of the US government first before we can really have a flexible immigration policy, then that would be ideal, but that's not going to happen. So what do? Do we shut the door until such time as that happens? Well, if we do, we're not going to get rid of immigration, of illegal immigration. They're going to keep coming in. People don't realize, they talk about border security. There was already a provision for that in the Reagan amnesty in 1986. So it's not true that people have not been taking care of the borders. It's just that it's impossible unless you seal off the borders completely, in which case it would have a traumatic effect because about 60 million people visit the United States every year for different reasons. 60 million. So if you seal off the borders, can you imagine the effect of taking 60 million visitors out of the US economy every year? It would be colossal. So you can't really shut the door. And again, even if you were able to do that, the cost would be monumental. And if you only do it partially, you're still going to get illegal immigrants. The Fence Act was passed under President Bush with votes from both Democrats and Republicans in 2006. A year after that, and that really was a major effort to secure the border and a major effort to stem the inflow of immigrants, of illegal immigrants. 1 year after that, in the top 10 states for immigration in the United States, illegal immigration had risen by, 500,000. Unless we completely shut the door and just generate this whole other problem, we need to understand that they're going to keep coming in, even if there is no structural reform to the US government, as we would all like to happen. So it's a very tough question. But I would say don't wait to solve other problems before you solve immigration. Because it's never going to be the case that you will have 20, 30 million immigrants here in an economy that can't take them. It just doesn't happen that way. The dynamics are such that you will get the immigrants that the economy needs and demands. How do we know that? Because just look at the history. Look at the numbers, and look at the numbers since 2005. So you can focus both on what happened just before the bursting of the bubble and what happened just after the first bursting of the bubble, and the effects are immediate. Supply and demand is much more effective than the police at taking care of immigration. It's amazing. The same thing happened, by the way, in the year 2000, when the previous bubble burst. The growth of government has had this effect that it creates bubbles every few years. Well, every time they burst, immigration just goes down dramatically. And it's just a spontaneous process. I think the lady's going to go first. Yeah.
Okay. So basically my question is, how is there a demand for labor for immigrants? Because I have a very small awareness of what's actually happening in the world. And from what I've been hearing, there's increased globalization, which takes away American jobs, and we still have a fairly high unemployment rate as far as I'm aware. So how does that leave room for immigrant jobs? Yeah.
Well, great question. You've seen unemployment rise during the recession in the last few years. I mean, we're not technically in a recession, but it feels like it's a kind of semi-recession. But unemployment just before that, before the bursting of the bubble and the onset of the recession, was very low in the United States, between 5 and 6%, not even 6%. So clearly, globalization cannot have been taking away all that many jobs from the U.S. economy. Otherwise, the unemployment rate would not be that low. I looked in particular at Arizona, which is, as you know, it's one of the flashpoints of this debate, and it's a place where controversial laws have been passed in the last few years, and it's really very much been a focus of this discussion. So I looked at Arizona, unemployment in Arizona. About 10% of the labor force is immigrant. What is the unemployment rate? Arizona has one of the lowest in the country. And what's the kind of historical average? It's about 4%. And it has a huge immigrant population, and 10% of the labor force is immigrant. So clearly, it cannot be the case that immigrants are taking jobs away from them. Otherwise, you wouldn't have 4% unemployment, which is really full employment. I mean, that's what qualifies for. You're never going to get 0% because it doesn't work like that. There's always going to be a small segment of population that's unemployed. Again, what is happening today is not really due to immigration, because you're not getting that many immigrants anymore. As I mentioned, net immigration dropped to 0 until 2010. And I think in 2010 it was negative, and after that we don't really have fresh data. But my guess is it really can't be all that different, because the economy has not been doing all that well anyway. So these things tend to adapt themselves to what is happening in the real world. I saw one study, but I would kind of take that with a grain of salt. We don't know yet. We don't have fresh data. But one study indicates that there's been, since 2008, say the beginning of the recession, another 600,000 illegal immigrants, undocumented immigrants, have been added to the pool of illegal immigrants, which is really a very small number by historical standards. Historical, I mean contemporary still. It's still very, very small. So the recession or semi-recession the United States has been suffering in the last few years cannot possibly be the result of immigration.
I was wondering what you think of the Bush-Kennedy attempt to reform immigration, which of course failed.
Well, I think it would have been great if immigration had been reformed under a Republican government, because I think this debate is going to be won or lost among Republicans, really. It's the debate going on among Republicans, I think, is going to be definitive for this issue. And I live in D.C., so you tend to run into politicians in D.C. wherever you go. I've spoken to some Republicans who are very much pro-immigration, and they're very much aware of this. I mean, they tell you it's really a debate among ourselves, among conservatives. And there's always been a split among conservatives. You've always had a side of conservatives that's very much pro-immigration, and another that's more critical. So it would have been great if that had happened under Republicans. Just as the opening to China probably made a lot more sense under Nixon than under a Democratic under a Democrat, because it's just the way it works. You have more moral authority. You have a greater chance of persuading people who would otherwise not be persuaded by their adversary. People forget something. When Bush came into office, this was, of course, before 9/11. His first major initiative was immigration reform. People forget this. And the first thing he did is, I can't remember if he went to Mexico or he invited the Mexican president over here. I think he may have gone to Mexico. And he announced I'm going to push immigration reform real hard. And this was the very beginning of his government, so he really wanted to put it on the top of his agenda. And of course, after 9/11, obviously he had more important and immediate issues to take care of, and people completely forgot about this. And then when he took up the issue again, it was already a very different era, and people had completely forgotten that that was one of his initiatives at the very beginning of his government. Today, I think it's going to be very tough. The current president looks very weak politically, so I don't think he has the strength to push this through the House, and Republicans are divided. So that debate needs to be won among Republicans first, I think, before we have a realistic chance of getting immigration reform.
We have time for one last question.
Do you believe that many of the social issues, crime, poverty, educational issues that are associated with immigrants are the result of a strict immigration policy, and that if people were allowed to participate in the formal economy and not have to live in the shadows, that many of those issues would resolve themselves more effectively?
I think so, but I would go I would go beyond that. I think the problem is the U.S. economy itself. So when immigrants come into the U.S. economy, of course they can contribute to the economy, but what they can't do is change the way the economy works. If there's something that's coming in the way of generating more wealth, then they're going to be the victims of that just as much as the native population is. So if the issue is the government has grown too much, there's just too much interference, creating businesses and creating jobs is a very complicated issue today in the United States, then that by definition is going to impact immigrants probably even more. Because of course a lot of low-skilled immigrants come into the economy every year. So it's really a byproduct not so much of immigration as of the environment into which they come, which again doesn't mean that they don't have any opportunities. If they didn't, they wouldn't come in. And the rate of poverty has not really so much to do with the fact that they're immigrants in the U.S. economy, but the fact that you have people continuing to come into the country at the low end of the scale. So obviously, if you have poor people coming in every year, there's always going to be a segment of the immigrant population that's going to be poor. The interesting thing to watch is how fast they move up the scale. And again, there's some information about this in the book. And they're moving up very, very fast, and pretty much at the same rate than people in the U.S., native U.S. Americans who are poor. The rate of poverty among immigrants today is about 16 to 17%. Among natives, it's about 12%. Some people say 13%. So it's not, the disparity is not that huge. But it's mostly explained not so much by their immigrant condition as just the fact that you have continuing waves of poor people coming into the economy. Okay, well, thank you so much again. Pleasure being here. So, thank you.
How long are you here?
I'm leaving tomorrow morning.
Oh, okay. And are they keeping you busy, or?
I have a video conference